Hi, this is Rick Levine with the mid-month update for July of 2018. This is going out to all of you patrons at a solar level and higher. That includes the solar level, the planetary level that gets the weekly cosmic quickies. It includes the galactic level that gets the once-a-month chart interpretation class, and the cosmic levels that get an online meeting and to study a little bit more in depth. So, to all of you, this is my first offering on the solar level, and I hope that it sets the tone for what comes next. I hope that these will get better as I go on. The content will be good. It's me. It's me doing my thing, but I'm still learning to use the tools that I'll be using at home in my home studio rather than the monthlies that I record at Soul Food Coffee House. So here we are mid-month, and it's proving to be a pretty crazy month, an exciting month, and a difficult month with the eclipse that's already gone down. We have more to come. In fact, we've experienced the first of 3 eclipses. Eclipses typically come in pairs, occasionally 3 at a time. Eclipses occur when the sun and moon line up either at the new moon or the full moon close to the nodal axis, which they did now. I want to use this month's mid-monthly update to talk about the difference between trines and squares. Actually, I want to talk about squares because in particular, we have some squares coming up that will differentiate this past eclipse, the Cancer new moon eclipse that we just experienced, from the upcoming Aquarius full moon eclipse, which the difference is that the previous eclipse, the Cancer new moon eclipse, had a grand trine during the eclipse or right around it, although we might have focused on the fact that the new moon was opposed to Pluto, which is intense because Pluto is the planet of transformation, and it's the planet of evolution, of death and rebirth. It's a pretty serious energy. But the fact that we had a grand trine with Saturn, Uranus, and Venus, Saturn in early Capricorn, Uranus in early Taurus, and Venus in early Virgo, this practical grand trine really gave us a way to ground out the energy. And I talked about this in depth during last week's Cosmic Quickie weekly update for those at the planetary level. And I told the planetary patrons last week that this week's update I would delve into the squares. But instead of doing that on the weekly, I want to bring that into the once a month, mid-month update because it's important. And I have a different topic that I will get out to those of you who are on the weekly. So I want to start off here looking at the solar eclipse chart for July 12th, 2018 at 7:47 p.m. This is the one that just passed. And although there was a very strong opposition between the sun and the moon at 20 degrees and then some, 20 degrees 41 minutes of Cancer, opposite Pluto at 20 degrees of Capricorn, this was very powerful. Look, Pluto is the planet of deep, powerful metamorphosis, transformation. It's the planet of death and regeneration. It's not an easy planet because it's kind of like the roto-rooter of planets. It goes in and gets everything out from the unconscious that's hidden, brings it out into the open, and then we have to deal with it. And so we had some of that and still have some of that going on with that opposition. But the magic of this particular eclipse that's just passed was the fact that we had this grand trine, a triangle based with Uranus at 2 degrees and then some of Taurus, Venus at 3 degrees of Virgo, and Saturn at 4 degrees of Capricorn. Now, the slowest moving planets in here, Saturn and Uranus, are very close to being trine, and in fact, Saturn being retrograde backs up within a half a degree of making that trine exact again, but it never quite reaches it. And however, and this is the important piece here, is that as Venus moves through that middle point, 2, 3, 4, it's like Venus picks up on both of them and goes and kind of grabs them into being. And so this was a very important example of how a grand trine can ameliorate and perhaps soften the blow of what would be otherwise a very tough energy. And granted, there were some tough things that went down politically and that are still in process. I'm not saying it makes it go away completely, but we have this grand trine to thank for at least taking some of the disaster away from a potential disaster. Okay, so I want to shift gears here a moment. I've taken away all the trines, and we're looking still at the chart for the new moon eclipse on July 12th, but now we're only showing some of the oppositions and squares. And we can see here the opposition between the sun and the moon and Pluto. And we can also see this rather thin line, which is a square between Mars and Uranus. Now, we're going to watch this over the next couple of weeks because I want you to see how the squares and oppositions become more and more of a pattern until we reach the full moon eclipse, the full moon in Aquarius eclipse. The Mars square Uranus is a significant piece of what we're talking about today because Mars first squared Uranus back in May when Mars first moved into Aquarius, and then at 0 degrees of Aquarius, because Uranus had just moved into Taurus, there was a square between Mars and Uranus at 0 degrees of Aquarius and Taurus. And then Mars moved on, Uranus moved on slowly, and then Mars actually turned retrograde the end of June, June 26th. And then as it began retrograding, which it is now, it moved closer and closer until, let's move this ahead a little bit. And you can see as Mars goes retrograde, we're looking here strictly at the relationship between Mars and Uranus. But you can also see now that as the sun moves ahead a degree a day, it's going to move closer and closer to this square to Uranus. So watch what happens as Mars retrogrades back toward that 2 degrees of Aquarius. And as we continue that Mars retrograding backwards, you can see here on July 19th, the moon moves into Scorpio, and it picks up on an opposition from Scorpio to Uranus to the moon. It also just a few hours prior squared the sun at the end of Cancer, and it's also moving toward a square with Mars. Now I'm jumping this a day at a time, but now the moon through this period of time is picking up on this grand square that will come more and more into play. So we move ahead another day. On the 20th, the moon is now conjunct Jupiter. It's a little bit wide to be included in the exact square because that moon Jupiter now are at 13 degrees. And so it's enough degrees away. It's 11 degrees away from the opposition to Uranus and 8 degrees away. And we can just take just 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. That's 8 degrees difference. But as the moon moves around, it'll then move into Sagittarius on the 22nd. And then it moves into Capricorn on the 24th, lines up with Saturn. But then by the 26th, it lines up with Pluto. And then by 1:19 p.m. on July 27th, and this is Pacific Daylight Time, the moon reaches 4 degrees and 44 minutes. We could actually nudge that ahead just a minute or two. And there it is. At 1:21 p.m., the moon reaches 4 degrees 45 minutes of Aquarius. And the sun is at 4 degrees 45 minutes of Leo. And it's only a couple of degrees away from Uranus at 2 degrees of Taurus. And so at this full moon eclipse, instead of having the new moon opposing Pluto, we now have the full moon conjuncting Mars and the sun opposing Mars. And so this eclipse on the 27th actually has Mars involved in its stead. Okay, so what we're looking at now is the identical same chart, except we see some of these orange lines imposed over what we had before. And in fact, if we back this up just a couple of days, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, we can see here how Venus was much closer, exactly opposed that Neptune. And Venus is the planet of love and attraction and desire, and Neptune is the planet of spirituality and fantasy. And Venus and Neptune have affinity toward each other anyhow, but when they get together in an opposition, it's easy to project our own fantasies, our own spirituality, our own desires onto what's out there. And so it can be a little bit confusing at times. Now, I want to move this back forward to the eclipse itself on the 27th, and you can see that Venus is still within range of the opposition to Neptune, but Neptune is also halfway between the Moon-Mars conjunction and Uranus. And so what we have here is a midpoint, a halfway point, where Neptune is 45 degrees to the Moon and Mars, and 45 degrees to the Uranus. And in fact, it's still opposed Venus, but Venus is 45 degrees to the sun, and it's actually a square and a half. That's 90 degrees plus a half a square, 45 degrees. And so Venus is 135 degrees to Mars. That's a square and a half. And Venus is a square and a half to Uranus. And so what we have here is planets at several points, the Moon, Mars, 1, Neptune, 2, Uranus, 3, the Sun, North Node, 4, and Venus, 5. We have planets on 5 of 8 points on an 8-pointed star or on 2 interlaced grand squares. Now, this is a serious entangled ball of stress. The opposition certainly can bring some awareness, but the squares bring stress, bring tension. In ancient astrology, those grand trines and trines in general were considered to be positive. They were considered to be good, whereas the squares and oppositions were considered to be bad. Well, in modern astrology, we don't necessarily have that same good-bad differentiation, but there is an interesting connection because the trines are easy to express the energy. An easy expression of energy is nice, but it can be relaxing and it can be smooth, but it can also be lazy. And being lazy is sometimes really wonderful, but sometimes being lazy just perpetuates the old patterns, and those patterns may not even be the best patterns. The squares, on the other hand, in particular, are not so easy. I think of personal trainers saying, no pain, no gain. Now, I'm not sure that's always the case, but the fact of the matter is that squares can be painful and they make us focus our attention because there is inherent conflict. There is inherent stress. And we then go to resolve that stress, and that can be incredibly creative. Squares are very creative. Trines are relatively lazy. They can be creative, but we have to bust out of that kind of lackadaisical feeling like everything is okay. So the thing about this particular upcoming eclipse is the predominance of squares, oppositions, and in fact, half squares and square and a halves. Half squares are sometimes referred to as semi-squares, half squares, and a square and a half is referred to as a sesqui-square, like sesqui means 1.5. So this particular eclipse has a bundle of difficult energy tied up in it that doesn't make it bad. In fact, it makes it ripe with the potential for creating something very important. Now the question is, what are we going to create with it? You see, the problem is that when we have strong planets that are about the expression of emotion, of energy, of anger, and here we do have Mars. Remember, one of the points on this eclipse is the fact that the eclipsed moon is conjuncting retrograde Mars, which is opposed to the sun and square wild and crazy and unpredictable Uranus. So what happens when we don't express energy? Well, many of you who have been following my monthlies know that when we don't express energy, it gets suppressed if we do it consciously. I'm not feeling good about this, but I'm going to hold this anger in because I don't want anyone to know I'm angry. I don't want to lose my temper. Or we can do it unconsciously and totally not even acknowledge, be in denial about how pissed we are or how angry we are. In either case, whether it's conscious suppression or unconscious repression, in either case, what we're doing is we're burying that energy, which means that it's likely then to be projected. And rather than us feeling it inside, we bump into it out there. And when we bump into it out there, it seems like it's not ours. It's that jerk of our president. It's our husband or wife who's pissing us off because they're acting this way or that way. It's whatever a situation is. It can be a parent, it can be a child, it can be a waiter or a waitress at a restaurant. But when something grabs us way more than the event warrants, and I'm not saying that events don't warrant us getting angry, they do. But when we have this amount of energy that's unexpressed, we're looking for targets. We're looking for places to put this anger, to put this energy, and we may end up with misplaced anger, misplaced aggression. We may end up with people yelling at each other that aren't really mad at the other person. They're mad at something else and not expressing it. And so we could talk longer about this, but my point of this mid-monthly update is to understand that as we get closer toward the eclipse, towards the end of the month, that we may feel more and more of this energy if we're in touch with our emotions. We may feel more anger for what's going on with, let's say, politically, with little children being separated from their parents, or a leader who is making enemies out of our friends and making friends out of our enemies. Or it may be more on a personal level in a relationship, or even something that you want to do and aren't able to do it and get angry because you're stuck somewhere because that retrograde Mars is blocking your expression, and then someone comes in to help and you explode at them. You're not angry at them. You're angry, but the anger is easy to misplace. So what do we do with this? The Tibetan Buddhism in general tells us that the only thing that we can change is our awareness. And here, becoming aware, this is the magic of astrology. When we can become aware of the energy, when we can see it happening out there, whether it's ours or not, we can perceive it and we can put it into a larger framework, then we can work with it. Otherwise, it's invisible and we get caught up in it. We get entangled. We get sucked up in the whatever it is until we're in the middle of a drama that maybe isn't even our own. So the message that I'd like to bring to you on this mid-monthly update is that of being aware and not necessarily hiding our own negative emotions from our own awareness. Because if we hide them, if we bury them, if we deny them, if we pretend they're not there, they will explode around us one way or another. If we acknowledge them, at least we can talk about them. We can work through them. We can feel them. We can put them out somewhere in the open where they are actually become something that we can work through. I want to end with a poem by William Blake called A Poison Tree, because it addresses what happens when we don't express our feelings. If someone is a true friend, you tell them. I think it was Oscar Wilde who says that an enemy will stab you in the back, whereas your friend will stab you in the front. You see, if you're a friend, you express things out loud. William Blake wrote in these early poems called Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. This poem, A Poison Tree, is from his Songs of Experience, and it goes like this. I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it not, my wrath did grow. And I watered it in fears, night and morning with my tears. And I sunned it with my smiles and with soft, deceitful wiles. And it grew both day and night until it bore an apple bright. And my foe beheld its shine, and he knew that it was mine. And into my garden stole when the night had veiled the pole, and in the morning glad I see my foe outstretched beneath the tree. Don't hold on to your anger. Don't explode with it unconsciously, which is what will happen if we don't bring it into awareness. The key here is to bring things into awareness. And as we move closer to this eclipse and we watch things heat up around us, remember retrograde Mars, things heat up. And because Mercury is also turning retrograde just before this eclipse, it'll even be harder to get things out into the open that we want to talk about. And so do it now while there's time. Remember, it's the idea of you can't change things while you're in the midst of a temper tantrum, meltdown, difficult experience, and everything is erupted all around you. That's not the time to try to bring sense into the equation. The time is in advance by practicing. It's a yoga. When you can't change karma in the midst of a incredible event, you can change it gradually. As the yogi said, inch by inch, it's a cinch. Yard by yard, it's hard. And so this is the message that I leave you mid-month, and I will see many of you here locally at Soul Food Coffee House in Redmond. The rest of you will receive it online, and I'll also see some of you other people online with other offerings for different level patrons. Here's to you, and I'll see you soon. Thank you.